Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
Welcome to Mortification of Spin. My name's Carl Trueman. I'm a professor at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania, and I'm here as always with my co-host and long-standing friend, the Reverend Todd Pruitt, who is pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church, a congregation in the PCA in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Good to see you, Todd.
Good to see you, Carl. It's always a pleasure. I am delighted that you get to interact with me today. I can imagine it's quite a thrill.
It is a thrill. I mean, we've been doing this for, must be 15 years now.
Close to that. Yeah.
It never grows old.
Carl, when we started doing this, very few people even knew what a podcast was. That's how cutting edge we are. Yeah.
And we had only two microphones. So when we recorded with a guest in the basement of your church, we had to share one of the microphones.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
That's how low budget we are.
Yeah. So, and now, of course, the full capacities of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, which is a financial juggernaut, has been marshaled to get this podcast out far and wide.
We do. We have three microphones now. It's been a huge capital injection over the years.
Absolutely.
But talking about sort of doing it for 15 years, the world now is a very different place to what it was 15 years ago. Had we been discussing 15 years ago the kind of questions that we're pressing in on pastors today and ordinary lay Christians today, I think we would have had no idea of the complexity of the world in which we are involved. Not only have we seen transformations in terms of understandings of human identity, we've seen technological innovations that are simply breathtaking. I think, my grandfather was born around about 1900. He lived, by the time he died in the early 1990s, he'd seen some pretty amazing developments. He'd seen commercial flight. He had seen cheap automobiles. He'd seen a lot, but I still think that in the 30 years since his death, young people today have perhaps seen more technological transformation of their world than my grandfather ever did, and certainly any generation before him. And one of the areas, of course, where that pinches most, and where I think Protestantism is perhaps not as well equipped to cope as it should be, is in the area of medical ethics. As technology has developed, so medical technology has developed with leaps and bounds, and there have been tremendous gains on that front. My father died of cancer some 16, 17 years ago, and I'm pretty sure that if he had the same cancer today, the range of treatments and the prognosis would be a whole lot better than it was for him just a few years ago. On the other hand, developments in technology have also brought tremendous medical challenges, particularly touching on the beginning of life and the end of life care, but not restricted to those. And so what we want to do today is introduce our listeners to somebody that I think is one of the clearest and also one of the most significant thinkers about medical issues. My wife and I were at a conference in Toronto just a couple of years ago. Neither of us are medical or ethical people, and we heard this person give a lecture, and both of us came away from the lecture thinking we understood every word of the lecture and we understood why it was important. So it's a great pleasure and a great privilege to introduce today Farr Curlin. Farr Curlin is the Josiah C. Trent Professor of Medical Humanities at Duke University. Also holds appointment there in the School of Medicine, the Trent Center for Bioethics, Humanities, and the History of Medicine, the Divinity School, and the Keenan Institute for Ethics. And he's the author, along with Christopher Tollefson, the Catholic ethicist, of a book entitled The Way of Medicine, Ethics, and the Healing Profession. Farr, it's a great pleasure to see you again, and great pleasure to have you on as a guest.
Thank you, Carl. I'm delighted to be with you.
Farr, if you were to try to persuade the average pastor that they need to have at least some acquaintance with the kind of ways medical ethical discussions are going at the moment, what sort of arguments would you deploy to persuade them that, yes, this is crucial for you as a pastor?
I think I would start by observing that in my experience as a medical practitioner who is taking care of many people, both in the clinic and in the hospital, pastors, it seems, in our generation have, for the most part, when their people are sick, have trusted medical practitioners to be the leaders in deciding what's going to happen next, and have devoted themselves mostly to kind of spiritual support and their congregations to the practical support of meal trains and so on. But rarely does a pastor show up and either in the hospital or in people's homes when they're facing decisions about their treatment, show up and basically ask the person to consider what it is that their vocation as a Christian might call them to in the face of what they're dealing with. Instead, there's a default to, well, obviously you want to get the best available medical care at the best institution, and we'll be with you along the way. And that's not enough in our time. If it was ever enough, probably was never enough, but it's certainly not enough in our time insofar as the field of healthcare, the profession of medicine, is divided by disagreements about what medicine is for, divided by or even completely agnostic regarding what it means to be human. And in the absence of a clear understanding of how medicine fits into a well-lived life, is basically offering to do everything possible to try to keep people alive, or offering to relieve people's suffering, however that's understood, in ways that it seems to me are not really compatible with the Christian story. And if pastors are not aware of that, if they're not looking to get ahead of that with their folks, then their folks are going to be formed by healthcare, which is a massive operation, and are going to live and die in ways that are unfortunately not really witnessing to the goodness and truth and beauty of the gospel.
Yeah. You mentioned that question, what does it mean to be human? And Carl and I have talked about this a lot in recent years, because we've seen that the doctrine of biblical anthropology has never been something that has been so obviously pressing as a need in terms of instruction in our churches. And Protestants are playing a lot of catch up on this, where Roman Catholics have for centuries done a really good job in developing the doctrine of creation as it relates to the telos of the human body and marriage and all of those kinds of things. Protestants are catching up, and there's some good Protestants that are doing some good work in this, but it's still catch up. And so, for instance, I will be, every once in a while, I'm asked by someone in my church, and this goes back a number of years, if about IVF, in vitro fertilization. And so it's not unusual for me to talk to a couple who are adamantly against abortion because it's the destruction of a human person. So they're adamantly against abortion, and yet they haven't made a connection then that would have them think that there could be a problem with IVF, which usually ends in the destruction of a human person. How has that, any thoughts on how that or similar types of disconnects have been made? Can some of it be laid in the fact that we just haven't done a good job in our churches in addressing that question? What is a human? What are your thoughts there?
Todd, the evidence suggests that we have not done a great job of addressing what is a human. And I share the observation that you just made, that at least evangelicals that have been a part of my world and have shaped me, and I'm super grateful for that, are crystal clear on not aborting and on the sanctity of human life. And yet IVF is something that seems as a matter of course, people will consider without much thought. And if they do begin to think about it, the ones who do begin to think about it, will, I think, try to find some middle ground where they're only going to, or they're going to attempt to only generate those embryos which they're willing to have implanted. And they're not going to do what has become standard, the kind of screening and selection that discards embryos that don't look good enough.
Yeah.
But then the deeper question of what are we doing, or is this way of bringing about a baby one that is consistent with the Christian story and the tradition of the church, is almost never considered among evangelicals, unfortunately. And I was with a group actually last weekend. There's a remarkable organization called the National Embryo Adoption Center, where what are probably many of them evangelicals, people have had IVF and end up with, as they're called, excess embryos.
Yeah.
Then wake up and think, well, wait a minute, we can't take these, but we don't want them flushed down the commode. What can we do? And this center has developed where people can donate their embryos, and then if people are interested and willing, they can adopt those embryos. But that we're in that situation reflects a lot of thought that hasn't happened earlier.
Right. And I think that the advancing of technology, as Carl mentioned earlier, has created an expectation on the part of a lot of people. Well, since we can do this, then we should take advantage of it. And Christians have to have at least one more layer of consideration there, which is, should we, do this? We're not supposed to think, you've mentioned the story of the gospel, we have to apply things to our assessment, okay, yes, IVF makes this possible. It's painful that I can't have a child. I want to address that. It's a good thing for me to want a child. This technology allows me to have that. And so I should pursue it. And yet it can never be that simple for a Christian when we're talking about these kinds of technologies. Sometimes, and this is hard because I've had to say this to some lovely people. I've had to say, it might be that the only option you can pursue with a clean conscience is adoption. Maybe, bad things happen in a fallen world. Things don't always work the way they're supposed to work. But the technology you're considering here has some complexities that might conflict with what we know the Bible tells us about the dignity of a human life, et cetera. And that's hard. It's hard to tell people in a technologically advanced society that, what, you just may not get to have this. That's a hard thing.
And it requires formation of that virtue of patience.
Yes.
And particularly Christian patience, which is connected to Christian hope, that, most of us have not been well formed in a world and a culture where we've been used to being able to solve our problems readily with technological means.
Yeah.
Pivoting to thinking about Christian medical students and doctors, Farr, what advice would you give to, I have these all the time at Grove City, young people, they've done their Grove City degree and they're heading off, they're wanting to go off to medical school. What thoughts do you have in terms of how can a Christian moving into the medical profession at this point make sure that their own thinking about their vocation, their thinking about what they're going to be doing can be properly formed? What should they be thinking of as the appropriate doctor-patient relationship? I know you have a chapter on this in the book. How should they be thinking about their calling relative to the patients who cross their paths?
Well, there's a lot to say there, Carl. But they should, at the very least, go in with eyes open that healthcare is reasonably described as one of the powers and principalities that are good insofar as they are made by God. They are, as Saint Basil put it, with respect to medicine, they're a gift that corresponds to the kind of deficiency that we experience in our human nature after the fall. In this case, a tendency to get sick and be injured, and so they have a good purpose, but they become corrupted, and so they. I think my first message to specifically Christian students is remember our story. We expect the world to be filled with good things because it's created by God, and also to be prone to corruption and disorder. And so part of the challenge is from the outset to stay alert and to know that your task is going to be lifelong to discern the good from that which is not good, and you can't hand over your judgment to the system, or to those who don't understand the story, the truth about what it is to be human and what we are made for and what kinds of beings we are. So that's the first. The second would be, I think, and in our book we've tried to simplify this, but we hope in a way that does not distort, but it actually brings clarity. But that there are really these two different ways of understanding medicine that are operating today, and they're operating to varying extents in virtually every doctor's practice, depending on the context, depending on the kind of patients they're seeing, depending on their own formation, depending on their lack of formation. One of them is an old tradition that certainly the Hippocratic tradition contributed to decisively, but that also Jewish medicine and the Christian era contributed to substantially, that Islamic medicine has contributed to, and others have contributed to, but it understands this practice as being a moral practice, an art that has as its end the patient's health, so that when we set out to be medical practitioners, we're not professing to do what everybody tells us to do. We're not professing to relieve every kind of suffering people have. We're not professing to maximize quality life or minimize suffering. We are setting out to attend to the health of these living organisms, these human beings before us, respecting the character of human health and the character of human nature, and doing what we can within reason to preserve and restore their health. So it's a more humbled practice, but still a highly dignified one that the church has honored from the very beginning. It matters that our Lord demonstrated the inbreaking of his kingdom in a very dramatic way through his healings, and the church has always seen attending to those who are sick as really central to its vocation of hospitality to our neighbors. So that that's one way of understanding. The second way of understanding, which I've sort of already alluded to, we call the provider of services model. By the way, that first understanding we call the way of medicine. The second we call the provider of services model, and it has grown dramatically in influence, particularly over the last half century, not incidentally in tandem with the growth of technological possibilities, as you guys mentioned before, that generate in people, understandably, a desire to use those technological possibilities to bring about things that are desired. But the provider of services model sees medicine more as a set of capacities, technological capacities, sets of knowledge, capacities to intervene that we make available to the liberal self, which Carl, you've described, the rise and triumph of the modern self. The modern self is used to choosing authentically to enact their own identity and their own self-expression, to choose what they value, and medicine becomes a key tool in that. And in that understanding, medical practitioners are to provide services that patients can use according to their best lights to pursue the things that matter to them, which generally has come to be talked about under the heading of well-being, but where well-being is not a substantive concept. It's just a placeholder for what the patient desires.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Not long ago, my wife and I sat down, we had a meeting with a financial planner. And in our very first meeting, the subject matter got real sober real quick, because in our very first meeting, we started talking about end of life issues. And one of the questions he asked both my wife and I were, how long do you expect to live? And he said, I know that that's a difficult question to answer, but he said, as you look back at your own families, did your parents live a long time? Did their parents live a long time? And of course, what they're getting at is, how long do you think you're going to need, income? Are you going to live to be 70 or 80 or 90? And of course, now more and more people are living far longer because of some of these options. And I have a lot of conversations about people who are dealing with decisions about end of life care, either for themselves or for their parents. And one of the things that is such a struggle is that, on the one hand, wow, thankful for many of the options that good assisted living centers offer. My wife is in that industry, and yet the problematic part is that oftentimes we put people in these places out of a desire to protect them and to keep them well and to keep them from falling and hurting themselves and those kinds of things. So we take risk away, but we also take their dignity away in many ways. And this is really hard because as my mom is in an assisted living facility, and I struggle with this because she would be content. She would be tickled to death if the Lord took her home tomorrow. And certainly I don't want to make that happen artificially. And yet at the same time, how far do we go in protecting our loved ones in end of life care before it crosses a line and we realize what I've actually done is just robbed them of all dignity and self-determination and joy. Do you know what I'm getting at there? And how do we help people navigate it? I know that's hard, and I know there's not a pat answer for that, but it's interesting how many conversations I end up having there, because on the one hand, we don't want doctor-assisted death. That's a horrible direction to go, which is entirely different from someone deciding to decline certain treatments. And at the same time, we don't want to rob our aging loved ones of all sense of self, just in an effort to protect them, so that I don't feel guilty.
Yes. This is yes, I get you. And my impression is that if there's an area of healthcare into which pastors are most consistently drawn, it is visiting people who are getting closer to the end of life or have, as I put it with my patients, seem to have come to confront the limits of health and the limits of medicine. The limits of health being that we are not made to live forever. There's, as Gil Mylander, the theologian ethicist, puts it, there's an arc of a human life that we have to respect. And we can tell when that, sometimes it's cut off, of course, tragically very early, but at some point it is cut off. And then the limits of medicine. You mentioned earlier, lots of folks are living very aged states. And you mentioned in part because of what medicine can do. That's true to some extent, but for most people, it's actually not medicine that is helping people live long. It is good nutrition. We have incredible access to food like we never had. We have protection from all kinds of onslaughts that took people's lives out before. But as people get older, they will get more. They'll have more opportunities to be in the care of healthcare professionals. And then the question becomes a very practical one. When is that which is offered to me implicitly or explicitly by the medical professionals the sort of thing that I should avail myself of, or I should encourage my parent to avail him or herself of? And those are tough questions. it seems in the book we talk about this, but on reflection, it seems to me there are a few heuristics that are really helpful here. One, as you noted, we're never going to intentionally cause the death of a patient or hasten the death of a patient.
Yes.
So and this is the sort of thing that even otherwise good-willed, otherwise reasonable, faithful people can slip into.
Right.
Is when we start to see someone's condition as so diminished that we start to almost want to get them to death.
Yeah.
And then to act in such a way so that they die. So that's a boundary.
Right.
But within that boundary, the tradition that's developed in the Christian community, and as we noted earlier, this is another one of those that's been developed particularly in the Catholic tradition, is to distinguish what was called ordinary care from extraordinary. And I will say that's to me an unfortunate language that got used because it leads to misunderstanding. This doesn't not mean distinguish what is every day from what is once in a while. It doesn't mean that which is low tech from that which is high tech. What it means in the tradition is basically for this person in this context, does the thing offered to them, whether it's the next line of chemotherapy or the surgery or whatever, does it offer for them benefits, real goods, proportionate to the foreseen harms and side effects and burdens? And that's a decision that is to be made at the level of the person it pertains to, the one who has to make the decision. Yeah. And there's a lot of freedom in that. Thankfully, Christians recognize, look, we have a hope of resurrection, so we have the freedom to decline offers to keep us alive when that which will keep us alive involves too much fuss, distracts us too much from our vocation, interferes with things that are important to us, and so on.
Yeah, that's really helpful because again, more and more people are living with this because their parents are living so much longer, and it just is a hard thing for people to navigate. And so more than ever, and Carl, you alluded this at the very beginning, more than ever, we've got a generation of people that are having to navigate these types of medical ethical issues that to a large degree my parents didn't have to navigate, and certainly their parents didn't, but now all of a sudden we have to. And Carl, you've said several times that you would love to see more people who are going into ministry do at least some serious study on the issue of ethics, and how we need more Protestants going into and getting advanced degrees in ethics for the sake of service to the church specifically. And I think it's absolutely true. I mean, it's just needed. I mean, one of the things, again, you and I have talked about is that the Roman Catholic Church has a long tradition of dealing with these things substantively. Protestants now we're just trying to play catch up, and we need more of that. And I just tell you, I mean, on the ground in the church with God's people, I get questions about this stuff a lot and walk with people through this a lot. And so I would just again commend to our listeners this really excellent book. It's very helpful. It's a book that is it's not a tract, it's a serious book, but it's one that you can read. It is accessible, and it's called The Way of Medicine. And our guest Farr Curlin is one of the two authors of this book. And if you would like to go to our website, and we would encourage you to do that, mortificationofspin.org, you can enter to win a copy of this book. And we do have actual winners, so give it a shot. But if not, and you are wrestling with some of these issues, and if you're not yet, you will, then get some good guides along the way. Get some good counsel. And this book will give you good counsel on some of those issues, and will take you into those most essential topics, like what does it mean to be human? And where do we draw boundaries when we think about beginning of life issues and end of life issues, when we think about treatment and all of those things? These are issues that Christians are going to have to be thinking about more and more clearly and with greater biblical discernment. So we do recommend this book, The Way of Medicine. We hope that you'll get a copy. And while you're at our website, if you'd like to make a donation to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, you can feel free to do that. I know that they would appreciate that. But we're very thankful to our guest, Farr Curlin, for spending some time with us and helping us to think through some of these massively important issues. We're glad also that you were here to listen in on this conversation, and we'll look forward to being with you next time on Mortification of Spin.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.